Hi, Jasmine.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm doing good. It's been a really exciting day.
I know the presentations have been amazing.
Have you been tuning in?
Yeah, I have in between putting the finishing touches on mine. So,
Awesome. Well, I'm ready to introduce you. Like
okay.
everyone, okay. Jasmine Graham is from the Building Decarbonization Coalition. She is passionate advocate for a healthy, sustainable, and just world. She envisions a society in which the most vulnerable among us are empowered to be decision makers to ensure an equitable, clean energy transition. Currently, she is the New York Senior Policy and Campaign Manager at the Building Decarbonization Coalition. Prior to joining BDC, Jasmine served as the Energy Justice Policy Manager at We Act for Environmental Justice, where she was responsible for strengthening and advancing the organization's energy policy. Prior to We Act, Jasmine managed New York State's first and largest community choice aggregation at Sustainable Westchester. Jasmine is currently appointed to New York's Climate Mobilization Advisory Board, which presents implementation recommendations for New York City's landmark building decarbonization legislation, Local Law 97. Thank you, Jasmine. Really looking forward to your presentation today.
Thank you so much. All right, I'll get right into it. So I hope everyone is doing good and hopefully you got some time to stretch in between presentations. I know there's a lot of information to absorb, so if you need to do that during this presentation, no problem. So as mentioned, I'm Jasmine Graham, and today I'm going to talk to you about energy justice considerations in decarbonization policy. And that's mainly related to buildings. So we're going to cover first what energy justice is and what it absolutely is not. Then we're going to look at frameworks for energy justice, and then we're going to wrap it up with considerations and what that means for building decarb policy. So I have to start off with a quote from Shalonda Baker. She says, "The current energy transition holds great promise to dismantle deep-seated legacies of racism and oppression. I remain hopeful that state by state, those responsible for energy policy will see its vast potential to restructure harmful social relationships that we have come to regard as normal and natural." So let's get into energy justice. Energy justice is a part of the larger framework of a just transition and is intertwined with both climate and environmental justice that involve, environmental hazards and the climate crisis. What energy justice is equity in the distribution of benefits and burdens, affordability of energy costs, access to both opportunities and technologies, and participation in decision-making. And that's for all people, but with a prioritization of historically marginalized communities. We really are looking at the communities that have already been overburdened by fossil fuels and making sure that we can bring them these four kind of principles. What energy justice isn't is speaking on behalf of marginalized communities. It's not perpetuating environmental injustices, including environmental health hazards in buildings. It's not installing heat pumps and all electric technology in LMI or low-income homes without addressing the cost to run those appliances. Energy justice is not discriminatory hiring. It is not gentrification and displacement as a result of electrification and efficiency upgrades. And it is not the perpetuation of energy burdens, energy insecurity, and energy poverty, which are kind of three pillars that I'm going to break down for you all. So energy burden is the percentage of household income that you spend on energy. Right. The average non-low income family, so the average middle income family, spends about 3% of their income on energy expenditures. However, among low income households, that number is 8.6%. And in New York City, where I do a lot of my work, 1 in 4 of the low-income households in the city has an energy burden over 17%. 1 in 3 of both Black and Latinx households have a high energy burden here in the city. Up next is energy insecurity, and that relates to the hardships that households face when meeting basic household needs. So some really prominent examples of this are not using appliances because of energy costs. Oftentimes people don't run air conditioners in the summer because they're so fearful of what their energy bill might look like. Energy insecurity looks like exorbitant utility debt and disconnection notices and shutoffs. And it really relates to the cumulative burdens that are experienced by most vulnerable populations. And I'll get into that a little bit later. Dr. Diana Hernandez, who is really brilliant and puts out a lot of work at Columbia on energy insecurity. And she notes that energy insecurity has been linked to health and other hardships, with research finding that children in moderately and severely energy insecure homes are more prone to food insecurity, hospitalizations, poorer health ratings, and developmental concerns, more so than children in energy secure homes. And then there's energy poverty, and that's lack of access to energy itself, right? So having a disproportionate exposure to power outages or not having any access to power in the first place. The longest wait times after power outages are experienced by low-income communities of color. And a really terrifying example of this is that in the winter of 2018 to 2019, 87% of what we call NYCHA, New York City's Housing Authority apartments, went without heat or hot water at some point during the winter. And so energy poverty is a real issue, especially when we think about climate events and the increasing instability of the grid in the face of extreme storms and weather events. And, why alleviate energy poverty? Well, there are multiple benefits, including spending less money on health, reducing air pollution, better comfort, well-being, improving a household budget, and increased economic activity. But this is still something that is perpetuated. But why does this matter? And why does this matter for buildings? It matters because 90%, I'm sure a lot of us have seen this statistic, but 90% of our time is spent in buildings. So we rely on those buildings to keep us safe, to keep us healthy, to keep us protected from the elements that are getting more dangerous. And so to look at the connection between energy poverty and extreme heat in New York City, there are just a few kind of terrifying statistics here. So New York City may see an average temperature increase of 5.7 degrees Fahrenheit and a doubling of days above 90 degrees by the 2050s. In Harlem, indoor air temperatures were an average of 7 degrees higher than outdoor air temperatures. And that leads to heat-related deaths. And heat is the #1 weather-related killer. In New York, between 10 and 100 New Yorkers die each year due to heat stress and exacerbation of chronic conditions that they already have. And with the increase in hot days and the differential between indoor and outdoor temperatures, we actually are seeing that up to 5,800 people could die annually in New York City if our planet reaches 3 degrees of warming. Right. And so people are relying on their buildings to keep them safe. But right now, there is that is not the case. Here's a little case study from July 2019. There was a heat wave in New York City where power outages were directed to residents in Canarsie and Flatlands. So that community is majority Black. 40% is the number of residents in those neighborhoods that were born outside of the US. They left 50,000 residents without power during a significant heat wave. And not just during this heat wave in particular, but in general, 50% of heat fatalities in New York City are actually accounted for by Black New Yorkers. So Black New York City residents are dying at a rate 2 times higher when it comes to heat-related illness. So it's really crucial that we are addressing the cumulative environmental and energy burdens that affect low-income homes, communities of color, and that have really detrimental outcomes, obviously death being a very severe one. So these cumulative burdens can encompass that, low-income households, low-income families live in older, less efficient households with significant deferred maintenance and outdated appliances. Their neighborhoods have less green space, less cooling infrastructure. They're sited near polluting infrastructure. They're saddled by high energy cost burdens and utility debt. They have lead, mold, and asbestos exposure, which can cause respiratory issues, lower IQ, missed days of work. They have gas stoves, which produce 50 to 400% higher NOx levels, nitrous oxide, which increases the risk of childhood asthma. And RMI has a study that shows 42% increase if you have a gas stove in your home. Nationwide, nearly 1 in 10 public housing units lies in a floodplain. And there's a real lack of capital for upfront costs of building decarb and the costly pre-electrification measures. So you have these communities and you have these homes that are, being hit from every single direction. But buildings are a real opportunity. Decarbonizing buildings are a real opportunity. And so we're going to get into designing good policy and what are some of the frameworks for energy justice. And so we're going to start at the high level with the JEMEZ principles for democratic organizing. These are 6 principles that center on being inclusive, emphasizing bottom-up organizing, right? So going from the grassroots up, not top-down approaches, letting people speak for themselves, working together in solidarity and mutuality, building just relationships among ourselves, and having a commitment to self-transformation. And throughout this presentation, you'll find anything that's underlined is linked. And when you get the slides later, you'll be able to access all these resources. So another set of guiding principles are the 17 principles of environmental justice. I pulled out a few of them here that are very related to our work, but there's 17 of them. But number 2, environmental justice demands that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples, free from any form of discrimination or bias. Environmental justice affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination of all peoples. Environmental justice demands the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision-making, including needs assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. Environmental justice affirms the right of all workers to a safe and healthy work environment without being forced to choose between an unsafe livelihood and unemployment. It also affirms the right of those who work at home to be free from environmental hazards. And this one says, environmental justice protects the rights of victims of environmental injustice to receive full compensation and reparations for damages, as well as quality healthcare. And I do encourage everyone to look at the full 17 principles. They're honestly very beautiful. And so the goals of energy justice are really centered on these 4 things right here: reducing the energy burden that I talked about, alleviating energy poverty and energy insecurity, and then advancing energy democracy. And so energy democracy at its most basic is about communities actually having a say and having agency in shaping their future. And this book on the left, Energy Democracy, Advancing Equity and Clean Energy Solutions by Denise Fairchild, is one of my favorite books, and I highly, highly recommend that people take a look at it. There are a lot of great tools and information. And another really good resource for folks is the Energy Democracy Scorecard by Emerald Cities Collaborative. They actually have this scorecard that is broken down into these 4 categories on the right: social justice, regenerative energy systems, moral economy, and governance. And it is a tool that you can use to actually evaluate your own work. And this is one of my favorite tools. When I found this, I was just completely blown away by the amount of work that it went into it. This is from Facilitating Power, and it's called the Spectrum of Community Engagement. So when you're designing your decarb policies, you might start off here without even knowing it. You know, you're ignoring the communities. You're making decisions on behalf of them, right? And you might have instituted some DEI practices, and now you're informing them and you're letting them know, you're giving them fact sheets, you're holding presentations. But, you know, for the most part, you're not actually following their guidance. So you move along this spectrum from ignoring to informing, consulting, involving, collaborating, and eventually deferring to. And the impact here is community ownership, right? We understand that it should be understood that the problems related to energy justice are very much structural, they're very much institutional. And so we have to be thinking really transformatively about how we engage with this moment to right some of the wrongs that have already existed. So I definitely encourage people to check out this resource. And then the Initiative for Energy Justice has a ton of resources. 3 that are very incredible are the Energy Justice Workbook. So this gives you a lot of background information on what energy justice is. It kind of compares the definitions, because energy justice, energy democracy, these are new terms and there isn't a universal definition. So this really looks at, you know, what is energy justice? And then they have a scorecard, the Justice in 100 scorecard. And I highly encourage folks to look at this and actually go through and evaluate your policies, right? I'm going to show you an example on the next slide of what this one looks like. And then they have a separate tool, which is the Justice in 100 metrics, which is the tool for actually measuring equity in policy implementation. And so this is what the Justice in 100 scorecard looks like. You give a short answer, you score it, and you add up the totals. And these are the kind of overarching questions that are asked. First, in terms of process, have marginalized communities participated meaningfully in the policymaking process with sufficient support? Restoration, does the policy aim to remedy prior and present harms faced by communities negatively impacted in the energy system? Decision-making, does the policy center the decision-making of marginalized communities? And importantly, this is where they talk about the importance of ownership. Who's controlling the assets? Are they being controlled by the frontline communities that have borne the brunt of pollution? Working class people, those that have been historically disenfranchised, you know, really going beyond just having a say to deciding, you know, the outcome. Benefits, does the policy center economic, social, or health benefits for marginalized communities? And this includes non-energy areas like gentrification and displacement that I mentioned earlier. And then access, does the policy make energy more accessible and affordable to marginalized communities? So these are some of the high-level questions that you can ask yourself. And then the Greenlining Institute actually has their own framework specific to equitable building electrification. This one is a little bit more limited in scope, but it has 5 steps. You assess the community's needs, you establish community-led decision-making, you develop metrics and a plan for tracking, ensure funding and program leveraging, and then eventually improve outcomes, you know, in continuum, evaluate the program and make continuous improvements. But the much larger idea here is to move from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, right? So this is a graphic that was created by Climate Justice Alliance. And you can see that you're moving from a society focused on exploitation to one focused on cooperation, where consumerism and a colonial mindset, extraction, militarism, and the enclosure of wealth and power are turned into regeneration of resources, deep democracy and governance, ecological and social well-being, and caring and sacredness in our worldview. And then movement generation updated it, and this one has kind of a bit going on, but it really, I think, solidifies or clarifies what we need to do, right? We need to stop the bad, we need to build the new, we need to divest from the powers that be in an extractive economy and begin to invest in our own power, feed and grow this living and regenerative economy. And so I will wrap up with considerations. And so when we're looking at building decarb policy, and this is not an exhaustive list, I definitely want to add that caveat here. This is just a few considerations based on a lot of work that I've done. So in the regulatory arena, consider setting a cap on household energy burdens, making a plan to transition off the gas system without overburdening historically marginalized communities. Explore equitable rate design and how to spread and recover costs equitably among ratepayers. Pilot new rate programs. Stop the build out of fossil fuel infrastructure, including connecting new homes to gas systems. Incorporate health outcomes into cost benefit analyses, right? When we're determining where we should be electrifying, we should be thinking about where is there going to be the greatest health outcomes, right? For the oldest, dirtiest, least efficient buildings, they stand to gain the most, right? And so incorporating that into our cost benefit analyses. Reforming utility shutoff practices and canceling utility debt. There's a huge utility debt crisis in New York right now. I haven't checked the numbers in a few months, but the number was around 1.6 billion just in residential energy utility debt here in New York. And in the downstate region, there was over 400,000 New York City and Westchester County residents that were behind on their utility bills. And so we really need to think about, and I almost included a slide in here and then I didn't, and maybe I should have, that said, like, you want to install a heat pump? Great. How is that person going to afford it? Right. And so we really have to be thinking about the affordability crisis and how to structurally deal with that when, making the decision to transition all of these buildings to all electric. So in the administrative arena, folks should be co-designing programs with communities, right? We need more programs for people without tax liability. We need direct pay for tax credits, which I know a lot of folks here have advocated for at some point. We need to intentionally design programs to prioritize low-income and BIPOC communities. That word prioritize is so important, right? It's easy to go for the low-hanging fruit, but the reality is there are so many structural barriers to improving the conditions for both low-income and BIPOC communities that we have to be intentional in putting them first. And that can mean tiering financial incentives so that the lowest income folks get the greatest subsidization. It's really, really important that we are figuring out how people can afford the energy that they're going to need to use in this clean energy transition. and establish funding carve-outs for marginalized populations so that technical difficulties or longer lead times don't prevent access to capital, right? You don't want all the money being snatched up in the first 5 minutes, and then the communities that really need it but had 6 months of pre-electrification work to do first, they now don't have access. And renters. We need solutions for renters, and we need to address the split and perverse incentives between landlords and renters. And I don't have the answers there. We also need to address pre-electrification and deferred maintenance, which I just talked about. We have to be setting aside large, really, really big buckets of funding to address deferred maintenance as a precursor to electrification. We need to be tying energy efficiency funding to environmental hazard remediation, right? You don't want a building, a family to be in a home that has just been made energy efficient and weatherized, and the building envelope is sealed, but you didn't address the black mold on the ceiling in their bathroom, right? You have to be concurrently addressing environmental hazards. And you have to prioritize that hazard remediation and energy efficiency work to keep the homes healthy and the costs low before going all electric. Emerald Cities Collaborative put out a report where they said, fund equity first building electrification pilots that target vulnerable communities in various markets and building types to assess climate, health, wealth, and income disparities, leading with building electrification measures, but also incorporating home repair, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and water conservation. And this kind of whole home retrofit approach is what a lot of these communities need. And we need more creative financing solutions to make this accessible at scale. Some workforce considerations are to diversify our workforce. One of the great parts about buildings is that they're everywhere. And so you have local jobs everywhere. And so you want to hire locally whenever possible. You want to engage underserved populations, right? The formerly incarcerated, low-income folks, anyone with limited English proficiency, BIPOC folks, veterans, et cetera. Support minority and women-owned business enterprises. We need to figure out how to ensure a just transition for fossil fuel workers. Shout out to utility or non-utility thermal energy networks. That is an exciting pathway for fossil fuel workers. You want to encourage unionization. We don't want a gig economy. We want workers with strong rights, and partner with groups on the ground often. And that brings us to outreach. You need to be meeting with the communities that you're looking to serve. You need to listen to their needs and, most importantly, honor their wishes. If what you think is best for them does not align with what they think is best for themselves, guess what? You shouldn't do it. And you should be building capacity within CBOs or community groups, own networks, rather than continuing to bring more resources to your own organization. Figure out how you can be a support and not, a detriment or overshadowing their work. When you're holding any kind of meetings, provide childcare, transportation reimbursements, and food to address any barriers to entry. Deliver results predictably and consistently. And that will help to building trust, but remember that building trust really does take time. And so the briefest of brief recaps is we need to prioritize LMI and BIPOC communities. We have to address historical injustices, design equitable energy rates, protect renters, prevent displacement, integrate resiliency, think holistically, create diversity, shift ownership, transform the way that we value systems, programs, economics, and increase and diversify labor. And remember, It's not your job to know it all. Communities most affected actually already know what they need. So just keep listening, learning, showing up, growing. And that's all I've got for you. So I'm happy to take questions.
You were blowing us away, so I'm sure you weren't reading all of the, oh my gosh, what a presentation comments that are over on the side, but you should check that out.
Okay, I have not been. And I didn't have an eye on time, so I was like, I don't know where I am.
You did the perfect 30 minutes because we started about 2 minutes late, and so you nailed it.
Awesome.
Like anything else about your presentation, that was so helpful. So many good resources. So we should transition. I think that you can respond perhaps to Tom Phillips' question, and there's maybe one or others, but people are just learning from you there. So that was fantastic. Thank you. And
thank you. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.